All right, we'll move on to the next session. It's actually a three-part session on what happened after Acts. You know, when you're reading the book of Acts, when you come to the end of Acts, right, you wonder, it's sort of left hanging and you're wondering, you know, what's the end of the story? Of course, we know the ultimate end of the story when you move on to read the book of Revelation. But somehow when you're at the book of Acts, the ending is kind of hanging, right? Right? It's like, it's almost like, you know, you leave it at a suspense. You see all these things happening, and then that's the end. Like, what next? You know, it's almost like a season finale, and you're waiting for the next season to start again. And what we're going to try to do with our session on what happened after Acts is basically look at some of the significant events that happened right after what happened with some of the historical events that took place as described in the book of Acts. Of course, we don't have time to really do a thorough survey of some of the complex, complicated issues that took place, both the logical debates and also, you know, a lot of the challenges that were brought about by heretical teachings and so on and so forth. That would take at least a semester of study for us to even touch on the surface some of these issues. But what we're going to try to do is perhaps look at what happened after Acts in a thematic method. Okay, and this afternoon, what we'll focus on is really on the issue of persecution. All right, because when you read the book of Acts, it was leading towards a time there was a lot of persecution. The disciples, the apostles were being persecuted. We're going to go along that theme and look at what were some of the issues that were involved. Were there persecution after what had happened, from what we read in the book of Acts? And has persecution ever stopped since then? Okay, even in our own setting, both in the Malaysian church and in the Singaporean church, are we experiencing persecution of any sort? Perhaps in the form of seduction of our souls as opposed to violent physical persecution. And at the end of my session, what I'll do is I'll give you some time in small groups to actually do some discussion as well, to talk about some of these things, and perhaps to end the session with a word of prayer in your little small group. Okay, so it will not just be, you know, a study, academic study or survey of the history of the church, but really to bring it down. What can we learn, the present church learn from what had happened in the past? Okay. Now, some people have asked, why should we look to the past? You know, we should always be looking into to the future. You know, the future of the church. The future is where we would be looking to. Why bother with the past? And I think, especially as followers of Christ, as Christians, it's very important for us to be bothered with the past, let's put it that way. For one reason, unlike other world religions out there, our faith, our Christian faith, is not merely about a set of doctrines. Okay, it's not merely a moral code, or it's not just merely philosophical ideas that is divorced from any historical relation. All right, it's not just a worldview, because ultimately our faith is the acts of God in time and space, and specifically, our faith is based on the fact that God, the divine Son of God, actually invaded our human space and time in history, in real-time history. Okay, it's not just some philosophical ideas out there that was thought up by someone who was sitting under some kind of tree, you know, which regardless of whether this person even exists or not, it doesn't matter. It's not really based on his life in that sense. Okay, because our faith is based on the fact that the divine Son of God died on the cross, and not just that, that wasn't the end of the story. He was resurrected. And really, it's based on those events, okay? Ultimately, that's what our faith is about. And therefore, to study the history of Christianity is to remember the historical character of our faith, and ultimately to appreciate the sovereignty of God throughout the history of humanity. And at the same time, not just to appreciate the sovereignty of God in our past, but to appreciate the sovereignty of God in our present and in our future. LT talked about persecution of the early church, where Peter was writing to the persecuted churches in Bithynia, in Asia Minor, you know. And a lot of the things that Peter wrote about to the early church is applicable today as well, you know, because of the fact that our God is sovereign, all right? And we can look to his sovereignty because he's still watching over us, looking over us, and we can trust that. And secondly, we, as Christians, I think there is a need for us to be bothered with what happened in the past because, like I said, the early church history gives us perspective when we look to scriptures for the will and revealed truth of God. You know, it's interesting, when you read the Bible, it's not merely a set of do's and don'ts. And of course, sometimes we wish that's the case, right? When we want to make a specific decision, like whether I should do this or that, you know, you open the Bible and you wish like, God, can't you just be more direct and clear and say, do it or not, right? But I think the beauty of how the Lord communicates to us and speaks to us concerning his will is not just simple as that. It's much more nuanced than that. He speaks to us through history. He speaks to us through events in the past where he reveals himself through human events, and you know, and it's humbling to know he reveals his grace, he reveals his glory and his power even through the failures of humanity. And that's the beauty of it all. And it's encouraging for me personally to know that God's sovereignty reigns overall in a sense. You know, to know that when I fail, because I will fail, you know, God is still there for me, you know. So we can look to the past, and it gives us perspective of how God reveals himself, leads and directs his people in the various nuanced ways that he does, sometimes very clearly and directly through prophecies, sometimes through, you know, in one instance in the Old Testament, through a donkey, you know. And it's amazing to just see how God, you know, you cannot put him in a box in that sense, you know. God reveals himself to us through human events. The writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, nothing is new under the sun, right? And that includes heresies as well, you know, and we'll look a little bit on that as well. Some of the heretical teachings of the early church still persist. You see remnants of that today, maybe in a slightly different form, you know, but they are not new in a sense. There's nothing new, really new under the sun. No issue, no predicament is really new under the sun. And in some ways, that again is encouraging. We look at our own local church. You know, you would think that your church has a problem that's unique to itself. Trust me, it's not, you know. Whatever problem that you have in your church, whatever problem that we have in our society with our government for that matter, you know, whatever persecution that you are experiencing, the Malaysian churches, they're experiencing the persecution in a form where you cannot use the word Allah, for example, right? It's not something that is new, you know, it's not something that is new. And God in his sovereignty will see us through. And thirdly, I think we need to be bothered with the past, because I think we cannot be so proud to think that we know better now. You know, to think that we know better now, just because we're technologically more advanced, just because we can, you know, flip open our iPad flap and we can have the Bible, you know, at our fingertips. You know, we can just Google anytime and get any kinds of information that you want on Wikipedia. Doesn't necessarily mean that we are wiser, that we know more about God in that sense, or that we are better. A term that was coined by a historical theologian by the name of Alan Gomes, he said that sometimes the church has what we call chauvinism of the present. You know, there's a comic strip, Charlie Brown. Are you familiar with the comic strip, right? Charlie Brown. In one of the strips, Charlie Brown's little sister Sally, right? Sally has been given an assignment by her teacher to write on church history, and she's supposed to write an essay on church history and hand it in. And so she was doing that, and Charlie Brown was looking over her shoulder, you know, and Charlie noticed that she was writing this: When writing about church history, she writes, we have to go back to the very beginning. Our pastor was born in 1930. And I think sometimes that is the case, right? When we think about church history, we immediately think of, when was our church founded, right? But instead of that, we ought to actually ask the question, when was the church founded? Or rather than when was our church was founded. Of course, in the strip, Charlie can only roll his eyes in response to what the little sister was writing, right? Church history, starts with when your pastor was born. Studying church history would only increase our humility about who we are and what we believe. Don't think that we got to where we are today, just like that, A lot of people today have lost their interest and understanding of history. Remember the time when the Da Vinci Code first came out? And there was this great challenge about the canon of the New Testament. And everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people panicked because the people are out to attack the church and the New Testament, And suddenly the church took an interest in actually teaching about how we got our New Testament, the books of the New Testament, how it got. And we realized it happened many years ago, and it wasn't what Dan Brown has described in his book. Not at all. But don't you think that this is something that we ought to be teaching every Christian in church, right from Sunday school? I don't know. I didn't quite grow up in Sunday school. I became a believer much older. But for those of you who grew up in Sunday school, when was the last time the canon of the New Testament was taught, how we got the canon of the New Testament, right? We ought to be looking more into some of these things. And I think this, what I call ahistorical climate, not particularly concerned about history that we are living in, is affecting the way we perceive truth in relation to reality as well. And I think for those of you who will be attending Brian's session on worldview, he'll say a little bit more about that as well. And I think this is, like I mentioned, not any different in our churches. We forget that we are not the brightest and the best. Just because today we have churches that have a few thousand people in our congregation, what do those early churches know? What do those early believers know? There were 15 of them. They meet in their small little church. Come on, we must know more than they do. We must be better. We must be smarter, right? I mean, come on, if you go to our church service today, the songs that we sing, the huge band that we have, we're not the brightest and the best, because we have much to learn from the great thinkers of the past. If you read any of the contemporary, well, not any, I would say many of the contemporary writers, famous ones, okay, and you are so impressed by what they're writing, chances are they've referred to an old, someone who has written on the same topic in the past. You read a lot of the writing about resurrection, about the incarnation, Chances are people like Athanasius have written about them. Chances are people like Origen has written about them. Chances are a lot of these ancient writings have already referred to some of these things, okay? We many times do not realize how indebted we are to those who have labored before us, right from the early church days. And nothing that the modern church that we enjoy today that is not a gift from the previous generation of God's people. Okay? Right up from theology, from doctrine, to even the Bible that we hold in our hands today. How the early Christians, the early church fathers labored over which are the books that are really authoritative. Okay? And which are the books that ought to be considered inspired by God. Today we pick up the Bible and we immediately know this is the Word of God. We can trust it. But how did we get to this point? And these are some of the questions that that we ought to ask, and that we can look to history and appreciate that a lot of this hard work has been done before us. And as we look at, like I say, I don't have all the luxury of time to look into detail a lot of the heresies that were debated over, a lot of the great schism, for example, that separated the Eastern Church and the Western Church and so on and so forth. But we will look at some of the significant events. But even as we do so, I want to, on a general picture, want to have a framework for the history of Christianity. And in introduction to his book Turning Points, historian Mark Knoll said this. He said that the last words of Jesus to his disciples outlined a very applicable framework for the history of Christianity. And he draws this from Jesus' words in the Great Commission that is found in Matthew 28. And the post-resurrection commands in Acts 1. A lot of times when we look at the Great Commission, immediately we think of evangelism, right? Evangelization, the call to go out there and make disciples. But Mark Knoll contends that this is also a very great framework, okay, in looking into the history of Christianity as well. In the last words of Jesus in Matthew 28, he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And I think the significance of these words is to say that nothing that happens to the followers of Christ is outside the sovereignty of God. Because all authority has been given to Christ. Nothing that happens to us is outside the sovereignty of God. How hopeful and how encouraging to know that, right? That no experiences that the church underwent or will undergo, no matter how ordinary or how glorious, were irrelevant to the living Word of God. Sometimes there are some things in our church history when we look in the past that we are ashamed of. And we'll see a little bit more about some of these when you watch the movie Luther tomorrow night. There will be some things that you watch and you say, how did we get there? What happened? What the corruption, the immorality in the church, what happened? And I often put myself in the shoes of some of those Christians who existed at that time, If I existed during the time of Martin Luther and I see the condition of the church as it was, I would completely give up hope and think you will never ever revive itself. It's gone just so far off the rail, But Jesus' words were encouraging. He says, all authority has been given to me in earth and in heaven. And that means that God is still in control. God is still in control. And because of that, he says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Of course, this is a call to go out there and evangelize, to go out there and make disciples. But it is also a call that reminds us the history of Christianity would always involve at least two related actions. As we become followers of Christ, it is always a movement to go out and a movement to an inward movement at the same time. A movement outward to reach places where Jesus' name is not heard of, to go out to a place or to go out to places and spread the gospel to many who have not heard of Christ. And yet at the same time to move inward to transform the hearts and minds of believers in the likeness of Christ. Because ultimately, it is only spiritually healthy followers of Christ who will beget spiritually healthy disciples, right? Because if those who go out there, okay, to make new disciples are not spiritually healthy themselves, they will at the same time make spiritually sick followers as well, right? So it's very important that even as we look at the course of our church history, we see how in the past, because the church was sick, it had begotten sick followers. But when the church got healthy, we start seeing revival in the church as well. And Jesus continues to say, he says, surely I will be with you always to the very ends of the age. again, an encouragement for us that wherever the church may wander, whatever sins that have been committed by Christians, either by individual Christians or by the body of Christ itself, the people of God would be sustained not by our own wisdom, but by the presence of Christ. Even as you watch the movie Luther, you see how God uses a man like him, an imperfect man like Luther, to bring revival to the church, to bring reform to the church. You realize that, the church has sinned, the church has done wrong, but even in the midst of that, God's grace moves. God's power still works in the hearts of people, because ultimately it's about God, it's not about us, right? And it was interesting because when LT talked about church worship, about how we have youth worship and adult worship, and I think one of the interesting things is we have made the church to be about us, because ultimately the church is not about us, it's about God. It is all about God. All of life is about God. All exists for God, through God, and to God. But sometimes we forget that. But even as we survey the history of the church, we see that ultimately it is about God, and God comes through people, through ordinary and sometimes very weak and flawed people, right? Gives us hope and gives us encouragement as well as we look at how flawed we ourselves are, but yet the Lord is gracious enough to even use us sometimes. And finally, Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth," to the ends of the earth. And that what it means is that the Christian faith would take root in a particular culture, and it would profoundly shape individual peoples and regions and nations. But ultimately, the Christian faith itself would belong to none of them. When I don't know how much you encounter believers from China. I've spoken to quite a few groups of Chinese believers from China, and there's this a certain sense of patriotism, like why should we read theologians who are writing from a Western perspective, or even when you talk to Chinese Asian non-Christians, especially from Chinese background, they will say Christianity is a Western religion, right? We Asians or we Chinese have the way already revealed to us through the Tao, or through Buddha's wisdom, and so on and so forth, right? But I think what is that for us to remember, even as we look to the past, is to know that ultimately Christianity is not to belong to any one culture. Okay, because when you read the end of the story in the book of Revelation, people of all tongues and nations will be there, and of all culture. It's not going to, sure, it went through certain people of a certain culture, it went through geographically through a certain area to get to where we are, but it certainly would not belong merely to those people. The church rather would exist to bear witness to God's love revealed in Christ, and our responsibility is to bear that witness throughout the whole world. And ultimately, that is the basis for us to go out there to do cross-cultural missions. All right. So that is sort of like, to set ourselves and say why this is important. And it's fascinating because I must confess I am a student of church history. I am by no means an expert in church history, but as I continue to just read about some of these events that took place in the past, it fascinates me to know just how much the church has gone through to get to where we are today, and how much the church is going through, today in our present day is so similar to what we've seen in the past. Immorality, check. Greed for power and money, check. Nothing is really new, and it's encouraging because. Not that all these things are happening. It's encouraging to know that God is still with us, that God is still present with us in the midst of all that. So we start off our series on what happened next, looking at persecution of the early church. And this is a question that is asked even today, both by the church in Malaysia and in Singapore. Christ or Caesar? Right? Christ or Caesar? PAP or Christ? Well, it's not really Barisan in that sense, but I guess so. In some ways, it's Barisan or Christ, right? But you know, throughout the history of the church has always faced persecution and problems of different kinds. All right. On one hand, externally, the church has to endure persecution from both the government or the state. All right, and I'm talking about the early church now. And at the same time, they also face persecution from, in the early days, it would be from the pagan, and of course today you have this whole band of the new atheists who is constantly attacking the Christian faith through their writings, right? And at the same time, internally, the church has had to deal with all sorts of heresies, okay, in the early days and even today as well. Maybe today not as pronounced, or maybe we don't recognize it, that's why we don't feel that it's happening, but it is definitely happening. And all this kind of external and internal pressure attempt to undermine the survival and the development of the church. Okay, external problems and internal problems. External problem in the sense of persecution from the state and non-believers, and internal problems of heretical teachings that comes up from within the church itself. All right. And many Christians today, I think they fail to consider that the church today was born of centuries of intense internal and external tribulations. You know, sometimes when I am speaking to a group of Christians, you know, on apologetics, they'll have questions like, you know, just a few weeks ago we were at this evangelistic meeting, you know, but most of them are actually Christians, you know, youth though. And they ask questions like, you know, if where is God today and what is he doing today? You know, I don't see him doing today anything today, so he must not exist or something like that, you know. And for me, it's fascinating because we would think that this is perhaps the first time a question like that is being asked, you know. But it's not, you know. Or another question that was being asked was on how is it that Jesus can pray to in the Garden of Gethsemane, if he is God, you know, how can he be praying to himself? Basically, it's the whole question about the you know, the Trinitarian understanding of God, right? Again, a question that the early church debated, quarreled over, you know, and labored intensely over to come to what our Orthodox belief is with regards to the Trinitarian God. It's not a new question. You know, in fact, it wasn't a question that was answered in one sitting like that. You know, they didn't meet one time and decide, okay, this is the conclusion. It was something that went on, you know, for a while. They met, they convened, and then there were others who came up and you know, trying to understand this Trinitarian God, came up with different ideas, and they had to meet again and debate and talk about it, pray, you know. And can you imagine the kind of work, the kind of mental and spiritual labor that went into deciding, you know, to firming and formulating some of the doctrines that we believe in today, you know. And it is good for us to remember that the early Church of Christ was not what the historical revisionists like Dan Brown or many of the other new atheists today, like even people like Dawkins. He would like you to believe that, you know, the early church was very powerful, it was very patriarchal, they always had things their way, you know, they could manipulate things, they could decide what books should go into the Bible, and that's why those who were on the sideline were excluded and so on. But that is not the case. The early church did not possess abundant political power and influence. And you know what? For me, it's fascinating because as soon as the church starts to have some semblance of political power and influence, what happened? It started decaying. And you will see that in the movie Luther. As it starts to have a little bit more power, okay, that's when it starts decaying. And that's when it needs to be reformed. And God stepped in, you know, through many other reformists other than Luther as well who came in. And of course, when we looked at Luther too on the last day, he wasn't the only person who actually tried to reform the church. There were many others who were also involved, who saw the problems and wanted to reform the church. Who would you think would be the first persecutors of believers of the way? The Jews. It's in your notes, right? The Jews were the first persecutors of the way. Okay. You remember when you read the book of Acts, right? How some of them were stoned to death by the Jews. Stephen, Paul, and Peter were all were the victims of the early persecution of the church when we read. And sometimes we read the persecution in Acts, and we don't really have a very clear idea of the level and the intensity of the persecution that took place in the early church. I mean, how much persecution actually happened. Of course, we read about Nero and the burning of Rome and so on and so forth, right? But how serious were some of the persecutions that took place? Now, during the first 2 centuries, before year 250, a lot of the persecution were mainly local and kind of sporadic. Okay, it wasn't something that was written in policy. Let's put it that way. Okay, it was really more sporadic, more local. Like local mobs. For example, remember the incident in the book of Acts, where in Ephesus, where the makers of the idols were very angry because now people are converting to become Christians, so they're losing their money. So it's almost like, can you imagine one day in Singapore, there are so many Christians that people are no longer worshipping idol. You go to Chinatown and then they are very angry at you. You Christians, because of you, we can no longer sell all our effigies that we sell for Qingming, all that, people out of business, right? Because nobody would buy this anymore, and they are like throwing stones or mob attack, right? So during the first 2 centuries, most of the persecution that took place were really more of that nature, okay, rather than rather than order of civil policy, okay. But nonetheless, there were several periods where people did die under Roman policy, okay. At one time in Bithynia, this is year 1112 in Bithynia. Bithynia is actually in modern Turkey, just south of Istanbul. And during that time, there was a governor by the name of Pliny the Young, and he basically wanted Christians to recant their faith. Okay. In fact, he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan at that time. He wrote in that letter, he detailed what he plans to do with the Christians. Basically, it's like if someone says, oh, I know who, let's say Joseph, I know who Joseph is a Christian, they are supposed to bring Joseph in and ask, are you going to recant? If he's not going to recant, then, he would be sentenced to death. Okay? After 3 chances to recant, if he refuses to, he would be sentenced to death. And it's fascinating because the letter that was written by Pliny the Young to Emperor Trajan, even though it was meant as something evil, because subsequently Emperor Trajan said, "Go ahead and do what this is. Go ahead, I give you the green light to do this." And Christians actually were sentenced to death at that time. Okay, but the letter that was written to Emperor Trajan by Pliny the Young, is actually today one of the extra biblical evidence, okay, to the divinity of Christ. Because in this letter, Pliny the Young actually describes how Christians worship this person as if he is a god. For me, we may think, oh, this is just a small point. I don't think it is. I think it's no coincidence as well. God in His sovereignty worked this in, for His own glory. The letter that was meant for evil to persecute the church, somehow the Lord used that. And that is a very strong, one of the strong evidence, because it's written by an enemy of the Christians. Okay, a very strong evidence to the divinity of Christ. Polycarp, he was one of the bishop in Smyrna, which is today in modern Turkey, Izmir. He actually died, was burned at the stake legend has it that he was tied to a stake and he was burned, but the fire didn't actually burn him. So they actually had to stab him, stab him to death, and he died. And Polycarp was actually, I wouldn't say a follower, but he was like a disciple of the Apostle John. Okay? So he's one of the apostolic fathers. So before 250, a lot of the persecution that took place were much more sporadic and local mobs and things like that. But after 250, year 250, persecution became more widespread and violent. And a lot of times, it was done under the command of Roman imperial government. You see, some of the things that we need to note is year 250 marked the millennium of the founding of Rome. Now, even though it was the millennium founding of Rome, at that time, the what do you call that? The imperial government at that time was actually decaying already. There were a lot of issues, and there were a lot of, in fact, economically, it wasn't doing well at all. And so when Emperor Decius at that time took over the imperial throne from his predecessor, it was a time of great instability. Okay, it was a great time of instability. And if you have any understanding of the Roman classical culture, they're very proud of their culture, they're very proud of their religion. Okay, and because they see it is failing, all these problems, it was very unstable. Emperor Decius decided that we need to save our culture. Okay, and he blamed it on the Christians. He blamed it on the Christians because he saw that there were a great number of people who were converting to Christianity, and he somehow claims that it is because of these Christians, it is because a lot of people are turning to Christianity that the gods are angry. Okay, and the gods are punishing us, and that's why we are at a time of instability. And he decided that he needed to do something drastic in order to save his empire. And this is when he made Caesar worship universal and compulsory, with the exception of the Jews. Okay, and at this time, Christianity was no longer seen as a Jewish cult. It was seen as a religion on its own. And he picked on the Christians because they were increasing rapidly in number. And because of that, because the Christians were very loyal to Christ. Okay, they worship Christ, they worship God. They don't worship Caesar in that sense. They saw them, Emperor Decius saw them as a threat, basically, to the state as well. All right, and in 250, what he did was Decius issued an edict that required everyone to offer annual sacrifices at the Roman altars to the Roman gods and to the Roman emperors. So regardless of whether you are a Christian or not, okay, even if you are a Christian, yes, you can be a Christian in that sense, okay, but you have to offer sacrifices at the altar to the Roman gods and to the Roman emperors. And when you do so, you will be given a certificate to say that you have done this, okay, and those who refuse would be tortured. And it was at this time that one of the early church fathers, Origen, was tortured badly. He didn't die at this time, but subsequently it was because of the torture that he experienced during this period that he died from. Okay, and it was during this time that many Christians were persecuted and died. And there was a writing by one of the church historian, well, actually he's a historian, who wrote that at that time there were no more place in prison for true criminals because the prisons were all filled with Christians. You know, pretty amazing when you think about it, right? The prison was filled with church leaders and Christians, but no more place for true criminals. But thankfully, this intense level of persecution only lasted a year, because by God's grace, Decius died the following year. Okay, so this severe persecution only happened for 1 year. Now, the most severe persecution that the Christians suffered was really under another emperor by the name of Diocletian. Diocletian was a strong military leader before he came to become the emperor. And this was around year 2, he lived, he was emperor around 300, I think. In March 303, when he came to the throne, he issued an edict which ordered the stopping of all meetings. Notice that when Decius was emperor, now he didn't say that Christians cannot worship, cannot worship. He didn't stop all these Christians from meeting. What he did was, you can worship, but you also have to sacrifice to the emperors, okay? But when Diocletian became the emperor, what he did was, he said Christians can no longer meet, okay? Churches have to be closed down or burnt down, and all who refuse to recant their belief in Christ are to be imprisoned, and all scriptures are to be burnt, okay? And later he also ordered that Christians offer sacrifices to the pagan gods, and if they do, they will face if they don't, they will face penalty of torture and of death. And many Christians at that time were punished by loss of property, imprisonment, and execution by the sword. Some of the more fortunate ones who didn't die were sent to hard labor camps, but ultimately a lot of them worked themselves, were worked to death in these mines. And again, this era of intense persecution slackened after Diocletian retired in 305, which was 2 years later, But you imagine, only 2 years, but it was a time of intense persecution, and a lot of people actually died. And after some other periods of minor persecution, Christians finally gained some peace when Emperor Galerius, he issued an edict from his deathbed in 311. And under this edict, Christianity was to be tolerated, okay, as long as it did not threaten or violate the peace of the Roman Empire. So Christians can continue to go to your church, okay, as long as you don't say anything against PAP or say anything against the Barisan national government. You can continue, we will tolerate you as long as you don't talk bad about or cause disharmony in society, in that sense, all right? And persecution by the Roman state finally ceased when, do you remember who it was who became emperor? Constantine, right? Stories have it that he saw a vision of Christ when he was out in battle in year 312, and the following year, in year 313, he issued an edict. This is the Edict of Milan, and he gave freedom of religion. Now, a lot of those historical revisionists will say, Constantine, because he was a Christian emperor, he gave Christian special preferences in that sense. But you have to remember that Edict of Milan was not just freedom of religion for Christian, it was freedom of religion for everybody, okay? So it was after that time there was a really I guess almost to a case of ceasing of persecution of the early Christians. So that was a speed survey of what happened in the early church, and it's fascinating, and I encourage you to pick up a book on church history and read some of the things that took place. It's amazing, the political tug of war that goes on, and the various church fathers who were involved in some of these, it's quite fascinating, all right? Now, when you survey and look at all the persecution that took place during the various periods before 313, you see that the causes of persecution can be broken down into a few categories, all right? Basically, you can see that one of the main causes of persecution is political. Now, as long as believers in Jesus or the Way were considered as a part of Judaism, they endured little harassment from the Roman state because they were regarded as sort of like a cult or a sect of Judaism. So they sort of left them alone, okay? But when Christianity began to distinguish itself from Judaism because, they followed Jesus, it came under the ban of Roman state because, and it was classified as a secret society, all right? And there are many reasons why they called it that because of just the way the Christians behave. They meet privately, sometimes in secret. They meet at night and they do all these things that seem very secretive. They do things like, I don't know, communion. What is that? blood of Christ and body of Christ and all that, it was classified as a secret society and has the potential to threaten the political position of the Roman state. Now, that is very important, and that was a big threat to the Roman state. They were very scared of them, okay? And because religion, as far as the Roman state was concerned, is that we can tolerate them as long as they keep the harmony in society, and if they submit to the state, in that sense, okay? So we will tolerate it if it contributed to the stability of the state. But as Christianity grew, with the number of people who converted into Christianity grew, and with the Christians believed with its exclusive claim, okay, on the loyalty of the followers, loyalty to Caesar was obviously compromised, right? Because believers in Jesus are now expected to give their full loyalty to Jesus, not to Caesar in that sense. I mean, primarily your loyalty would lie in following Jesus, okay? So loyalty to Caesar was compromised, and this loyalty to Christ is of course seen as a disloyalty to the Roman state. And a lot of these Roman political leaders, emperors, actually believe that the Christians are preparing or are getting ready to set up a state within a state. They actually believe that they are hatching some kind of plan to overthrow the government and set up perhaps a state on their own. And it is either the universal Roman state or the universal church of God will have to give way. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it's either the church or Caesar, right? And like I said just now, the early Christians' expression of their faith did very little to assuage the fears of the Romans. In fact, a lot of times it confirmed their suspicion. They will meet very privately, very secretly. Today, we don't, unless of course if you belong to a certain ethnic group, in this country, where you have to meet in secret, or if you visited some other country where as a Christian is illegal, you will know what it's like to having to meet in secret, to not say anything, okay? And this was what it was like in some ways for the early church. They would do all these things very secretively, privately, and the Christians would refuse to offer incense on the altars that were devoted to Roman emperors. They would refuse to serve as soldiers. Christians at that time were pacifists until mid-4th century, so a lot of them would refuse to serve as soldiers. And they would do all these things in secret, so the Roman officials will always think they must be hatching some kind of coup, right? I mean, why else are they behaving in a certain way? They refuse to do some of these things, right? And so because of all this, a lot of the Roman officials were very threatened and very scared, and they feel that they need to do something about it. And one of the ways to correct that was to either stop them from meeting, burn their scriptures, like what Diocletian did, make them recant their faith, and to make them confess their loyalty to Caesar, try to brainwash them by force and by violence. So political reason was one of the main causes of persecution. Secondly was religious. The Roman state religion was very mechanical, very external, and very legalistic in that sense, okay, where they would go to a temple, it had idols, there were altars, rites and rituals that you participate in. It's very evident for people to see. In fact, it's supposed to be evident for people to see because, they will all try to outdo each other in terms of their religiosity, So the Roman religion is very legalistic. You can see them when they go to the temple, you can see them going to the temple, that they are being religious in that sense. And the Romans, very much like the Chinese, have no problems adding new gods to the pantheon of gods and emperors that they have, that they worship, okay? So as long as, your God is subordinate, okay, to the prior claims and authority of the Roman state religion, it's okay. You know, so if you say, you know, Jesus is just one of the many gods, you know, and we would worship Jesus as we would worship, you know, the emperor or the various idols you have, then they have no problem. Okay, but the followers of Christ are expected to devote their complete loyalty to Christ, because it's only Christ alone who is divine, right? And therein lies the problem. Another problem is Christians don't have evident article of worship, right? They don't have an altar where they sacrifice their things. When they pray, they close their eyes and they pray, right? They have no idols. There's no visible object to which they were addressing their prayers to, because they were all spiritual and internal. And to many of the Romans who only knew worship to be something that you do and you can see doing, they're more accustomed to symbolic and material manifestations of their gods. They thought, they look at the Christians, you know, they pray like that, they close their eyes. This Christian must be atheistic, right? I don't see a God that they're worshipping to. They must all be atheists, right? And of course, the Christians meeting in secret, you know, and they do so-called very suspicious things like, you know, they have the kiss of peace. What is that? You know, because the Christians met in private, so a lot of these Roman, you know, pagans would never see all this being done, but they hear about it, all these rumors, right? Then they hear about how they eat and drink of Christ's body and blood. You know, what is that about, you know? Are they some kind of cannibals or what, you know? And they become very suspicious, and, you know, they don't know what it is about. Okay? So a lot of the Christians were accused of being incestuous, because the kiss of peace, whatever that is, they must be incestuous, right? They must be evil cannibals because they eat meat of a person and, you know, and drink the blood of this Christ. And all these were very repulsive to the Roman minds, you know, because the Romans are, you know, as far as they're concerned, they're very cultured, you know. These Christians, they're like, you know, what are they? You know, what are some of the things that they do? Yes. Yeah. 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 I mean, it wasn't a problem at all for them. You see, the thing is, their so-called spiritual, or rather their worship, is really very external. As long as, you know, one way to help you understand is how a lot of the loan sharks in Singapore, they all worship Tu Guan Tai, you know, while very religious. On festival days, they will make sure they give a lot of money, they'll burn joss sticks and all, very religious. At the same time, no problem with. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. In fact, that was one of the reasons as well when the Romans felt very threatened, because when they see the pure lives of the Christians, the transformed lives of the Christians, it actually convicts them of their own sin, you know, of their immoral lifestyle, and it makes them hate them even more, you know. Well, the Greeks were under the Roman reign. Yeah, the Roman Empire spread. Yeah. Good question. Which actually leads us to the next cause of persecution, which is much more social, okay? Christianity defended the equality of all people. But if you look at the Roman society, there's very clear what I would call caste system, very much like the Indian caste system when you see in India, okay? Very clear-cut, very aristocratic structure of the Roman society, and they're very proud of it. If you're there in the lower rung, there you will stay. If we are up there, there are certain ways that we behave, there are certain ways that we live, there are certain gods that we worship, and very, very differentiated from the lower rungs, and so on and so forth. But here comes this so-called religion that defended equality of all people. You know, look at some of Paul's writings, you know, that we're all in Christ, you know. And that didn't come across very well to the Romans, okay? And because of that, the Christian faith was very appealing to the lower strata of society and to slaves. In fact, up to a certain point in the Indian church history, that was the case, you know, where Christianity is seen as a religion for the lower caste people, right? The Hindu Brahmins are not, you know, Christianity is not for them, right? The Christianity is for the lower rung, lower caste people. So it's very similar. I see a similarity here, where it was appealing to the lower caste people, and because lower caste suddenly they gave them a new identity that they are, you know, in Christianity, in Christ, we are actually human, you know, not just merely slaves or belonging to the lower strata of society. And because of this, the Christians were hated by the influential aristocratic leaders of society, because they were threatened by the Christians' influence on the lower class, you know. And of course, Christians, you know, once those pagans become Christian, they stop taking part in some of these pagan gatherings and pagan activities, you know. They stop going to the Roman temples. They would stop going to some of these theaters that probably boast of, you know, either very violent form of entertainment or sexual or immoral. And places of recreation like, you know, some of the spas that Amanda was talking about, right? So once they become Christian, they don't go to these places. Where Christians lived counter-culture, where they went against social patterns, okay? Now when the Romans see this, they don't like it. They don't like it because they see it as some kind of non-conformity, okay? And they don't like that. And, you know, their moral lives too, the Christians' pure and moral lives, serve sort of like a reminder and a silent rebuke to the immorality, to the scandalous lives of the upper class people, some of the Roman people, the way they lived, okay? And because these Christians, you know, they have no fun. After they become Christian, you know, they don't go to spa, they don't, you know, they don't go to brothels anymore, you know, they don't do all these kinds of things. They start to believe that perhaps Christians are haters of mankind. You know, they probably don't like being human, you know, whatever. They don't enjoy, you know, what it means to be human in those words, you know. And it provoked some of these people to retaliate against the Christians, okay. So these are some of the social pressures that the Christian experienced that led them to be persecuted by the pagans at that time. And of course, there were economic reasons as well, and I said a little bit about that, about how at that time economically the empire was not doing well, and they blamed it on the Christians because they were superstitious. There was civic unrest, there was plague and famine, and these troubles were all attributed to the presence of Christianity. And because these people have forsaken their gods, okay, their pagan gods, and that's why the pagan gods are punishing them, okay. And it's not very different from what we experience today, right, where there's a lot of superstition and I remember I was talking to this lady recently, and she said something about how when she was young, I think she was younger, or her sister, you know, when she was asked whether she would want to believe in Jesus, you know, her father was very angry because her father said, you know, if you become a Christian, it will anger the spirits, anger the gods, okay, and it will bring bad luck on our family. Okay, very similar, right? I mean, this very superstitious belief that you cannot anger the gods and things like that. So because of all this economic, social, political reasons, the Christians were being persecuted by the pagans and the Romans. But you know, I always believe when there is persecution, there's always growth and development of the church. And And I guess in some sense, maybe we need some kind of, we need an ongoing level degree of persecution in the church for us to actually maintain what we ought to be, right? Because during the early church, with the persecution that they were going on, there was rapid spread of Christianity. You know, remember in the book of Acts, because of how they were persecuted, they spread it out and they went out there. And that sort of pushed the Christians out there. It's kind of like a forced mission, I guess, you know, where you're forced to go out there. And then, of course, there's another consequence, I guess, of persecution is therein lies in an increase or rise of internal problems as well. Remember Diocletian when he issued his edict burning of scriptures and recant and all that, there were Christians who recanted and there were Christians who actually gave up their scriptures to be burned. So when that period of persecution died off, all these Christians who recanted or had their scriptures burned, they decided to come back to the church. Okay, so the whole problem is, do we accept them or not now? Are they serious in their confession? Okay, and also, when you are at a time where you have to lay your life down to protect scriptures, a good question to ask is, are the scriptures worth protecting with my life? Are these truly the books that are inspired by God? And it's also because of this question that they started looking into the canon of the New Testament. Which are the books that are authoritative? Which are the books that are inspired by God that we will live and die for? I certainly, for example, wouldn't put my life down for the Gospel of Thomas, for example, right? But I would definitely lay my life down for the Gospel of Matthew, right? So these are some of the issues that later brought on when finally persecution died down in 313, that the church started to deal with some of the internal problems that they had. And that's when canons and creeds, and that's when they had councils that met to decide and discuss some of these things. One of the things that the era of persecution helps us to understand is, like I keep saying, is that the continual problem of the relation of the church and the Christians have to the state. As Christians, we are called to exclusive loyalty to Christ completely. And we are to be obedient to the state as long as allegiance to God is not compromised or violated. And you know, the issue of absolute loyalty to Christ or Caesar is a perennial problem. And we see that even today, right? It is a problem that exists in the church then, and it is a problem that exists even in the church today, even where we are, okay? And we can look to the history of early persecution as an example of how we should live under such circumstances. And it gives us hope, and it gives us encouragement to know that we are not alone in all this, you know, that we have fathers of the past who've gone through that, and we have God who is on our side to help us through all this as well. Now, in reflection and response, maybe we have 10 minutes of that, is I would like you to look at a couple of questions, and maybe in groups of 2 or maybe in groups of 3, okay? We're running out of time, but I want you to look at, you have the questions there, right? The first question is, what forms of persecution confront us in our local context? Cultural and social, or political or spiritual? All right? Discuss that question. And then the second one, what has been our response to such challenges? What form of apologetics are we offering to our persecutors? Okay. Now, this persecution may not necessarily be physical or violent persecution. It could just be something that is seducing the life of the church out of us. So if you can break into groups of 3 and discuss that for the next 10 minutes.